Hi everybody, and welcome to my introduction to gouache video. So if you've been using gouache for a little while, this could be a nice refresher, and if you're new to gouache, this will be a great introduction. So I've had a few messages from people saying they would like a video covering the basics of gouache, and I feel like, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like most people don't start painting with gouache. Most people probably start with watercolours or acrylic and then maybe come to gouache later because they've seen it on Instagram or Patreon and want to try it. But I've had messages from a few people saying I'm not that confident using it, I don't feel like I'm getting the best out of it, or I'm using gouache but I'm so used to using watercolours that I just keep adding loads and loads of water to it, which is a really common problem. So yeah, we're just going to be covering the basics of gouache. What is it? How is it different to watercolours and acrylic, and how is it similar? What are the unique properties of gouache, and how do I use those unique properties in my work? Because I love gouache, it's a huge part of my work, and yeah, it does form a big part of my style. So I'm going to be looking at that. But first of all, I'm going to talk about the different types of gouache available, because there are quite a few available. So what I use is Winsor & Newton designer gouache. And this is what I would call a classic gouache. When you think of gouache, you think opaque, flat, matte, creamy. This is all of that. This is a very, very classic gouache, water soluble. So it's designer's gouache, and that's probably what you're going to use. It's what I use. I actually only learned this recently, the difference between designer's gouache and artist gouache. So designer's gouache is designed to be really opaque and flat and matte. It was created for designers, animators, illustrators to produce work that was very flat and even and easy to reproduce. So it has fillers in it that make it really opaque and even and matte and kind of velvety. It's not necessarily very light fast, but because it was designed for illustrators and animators and their work's going to be scanned and reproduced, or maybe their work's going to be in sketchbooks, it doesn't really matter that it's not that light fast. The main thing is the opacity and that flat, even finish. So if you're doing most of your work in sketchbooks, or like me, your work's being scanned and reproduced and then, stored somewhere else. I store my work in kind of archive boxes. It's absolutely fine that it's not really light fast. If you were painting a piece with gouache that was going to be sold at a gallery, it would matter more, and in that case you'd probably want to use artist gouache, which will be light fast but will be slightly less opaque and not have such a big range of colours. So those are the two different types. I use designers because it's perfect for my needs and what I do. But yeah, it depends what you're doing, whether you want to go for designer's gouache or artist gouache. But I would say designer's gouache is the default. It's the one that's going to be easiest to find. That's probably the one you're already using. And then the other thing is different types of gouache. So this is Winsor & Newton designer's gouache. Like I say, classic gouache. It is opaque and it is water soluble. So I'm also going to have a look at acrylic gouache. So this one is from Holbein. This is also opaque, but it's not water soluble. So that is a pro and a con. I don't personally use this paint very often. I really like the Winsor & Newton, and I like that it's water soluble, but I know a lot of artists that do amazing stuff with acrylic gouache, and it is their go-to, and they really like that it is not water soluble, that once it's dry, that's it, because it means you can do a lot of layering without worrying about anything reactivating underneath. So you can do lots and lots of layering, lots of detail and depth, and some artists do amazing stuff with acrylic gouache, but I've tried it, it wasn't for me. Comparing gouache to acrylic and watercolours in a minute. Other types of gouache that you might find are You can get pan gouache from Caran d'Ache and maybe some other brands. So it's gouache that comes in a pan. You reactivate it with water. It's a little bit like watercolours. It's good for doing gouache on the go. I haven't actually used it personally, but that is an option. And then another type of gouache you might have come across is the jelly gouache from Himi. Now, I haven't used it personally and I wouldn't buy it because it just doesn't really suit my painting style. So it comes in a box with these kind of lots of little pans of gouache with a jelly consistency. So they don't have that kind of thick, opaque, matte consistency of classic gouache. They're kind of semi-transparent, kind of semi-opaque, with a kind of jelly consistency, and they come in these kind of really bright pastel colours, lots and lots of colours. So I think the way most people use it is they just use the colours straight out of the pans. I don't think the setup encourages people to mix colours. I mean, you can take the colours out of the pan, put them on a separate palette and mix them, but I think predominantly people are using them straight out of the pans because there's so many colours already. And I think obviously it's a really lovely looking set and it's really fun and it's really cute, which is why lots of people like it, and I think they're nice to use. So I'm not going to say don't buy it, because I think anything that gets people painting and makes creating fun is brilliant. It just wouldn't work for me personally because mixing everything from the primary colours, mixing all my colours from scratch is just such a big part of how I work. So that set just wouldn't work for me because I probably wouldn't use most of the colours, and I like the opaqueness and kind of matte finish of classic gouache. But yeah, that is a different type of gouache that is available. So let's have a look at the properties of gouache. And by the way, I have this here because obviously I did write a book called Get Started with Gouache. So if you are completely new to gouache, I do really recommend this book because it just covers a lot of the basics, and it will kind of reinforce some of what I'm talking about today in even more detail. It's got loads of exercises. So yeah, I do recommend that if you don't have it already. So let's see how these paints perform. So first of all, we've got Winsor & Newton Designer's Gouache in Flame Red. And I'm using a disposable palette, which is kind of my go-to. I think this is a Winsor & Newton. I've actually cut the cover off so I can't show it, but this is the Winsor & Newton disposable palette, which is great for gouache, acrylic gouache, that kind of thing. So straight out of the tube, it's quite thick and buttery. I'm going to paint a little swatch. So it's quite thick and opaque, and we can kind of get a bit of dry brush texture as we're running out of paint on the brush, which can be quite a nice effect, getting that dry brush. And then if I mix a bit of water with it, you'll see it kind of behaves a lot like watercolours in the way that it pools. So next up, we've got the acrylic gouache. This is Holbein, and this colour is Scarlet. Very kind of smooth, straight out of the tube. So it applies quite differently. I don't get so much of that dry texture, so it goes on very smoothly. Kind of getting a little bit of dry texture as it gets towards the edge, but yeah, it goes on super smoothly. And then you can kind of water it down, but yeah, there we go. A bit more water, and you can get it to kind of behave like a watercolour. So next I've got the acrylic paint. This is from Reeves and it is Vermilion. This is a bit more blobby out of the tube, but that's probably just due to the age of the paint. So again, we can get that kind of dry brush texture and going on quite smoothly. And we can also add water to the acrylic as well. And then finally the watercolour. So I've got some cadmium red on the palette here. So mixing water with the paint, so it's never going to be as thick as these are straight out the tube. And then I can add some more water to it, and you kind of see that sort of classic watercolour wet on wet bleeding of pigment. So obviously with watercolour you can get all these lovely, very transparent layers. But let's try them on black paper, because I think that will really help us see the difference in opacity. So first up we have the Winsor & Newton Flame Red. So that's going on nice and opaque, and if you want to work on black paper, you don't add any water to the paint. You want it straight out of the tube. I mean, if it's a bit dry, you can add the tiniest bit of water to loosen it, but the more water you add, the more transparent it's becoming. So if you can, if you're going to work on black paper or coloured paper, use the paint straight out the tube and make sure you're using a nice new tube that hasn't dried up, so that it's going to be a kind of a workable texture. I mean, you can wet your brush beforehand, that makes it more easy to handle, but don't mix water into the paint because it'll be less opaque. So that was the Winsor & Newton gouache. Let's try the acrylic gouache. Again, going on really nice and opaque and kind of standing out nicely on the black. And then we've got just the regular acrylic. So that is way less opaque. I'm going to dry my brush and just check that it's not my brush being wet. Okay, let's try again with the acrylic. Yeah, it's kind of, where it's thicker, it is opaque, but it's not as opaque as these, and where it gets thinner towards the edges it's more kind of semi-opaque. So definitely the opacity is not as strong as the gouache, and that's really one of the fundamental things about gouache, that it's opaque. And then we've got our watercolours. And they're showing up a little bit, but not much. As that dries, I think it's going to be more transparent. The black's going to come through more as it dries. So I want to be able to draw on top of the gouache with a pencil, whether that is a graphite pencil or a coloured pencil. I love using mixed media, so being able to layer dry media on top of the paint is really important to me and my process. So first of all, we've got our regular Winsor & Newton gouache, and no problems drawing on top of that, takes the pencil really well. Next, we've got the acrylic gouache, and this should be where the acrylic gouache is different to regular acrylic, in that it should take mixed media better. So I can draw on top with the pencil, It feels slightly different to this one, less, tiny bit more shiny, slightly less matte, but still it's kind of shown up no problem. And then the acrylic, it feels really shiny. There's a kind of squeakiness working on top, which yeah, doesn't feel great. And then watercolour, is that dry? No problem, and the pencil actually feels quite velvety. So with these two, because they are matte, they're not shiny, it feels like the pencil kind of sinks in a little bit, and yeah, the pencil isn't just kind of sitting on top. There's no kind of squeaky plastickiness. Whereas this one, it really feels like the pencil's just sitting on top, and it was quite squeaky when I was doing it. But this one was matte enough that I could do the pencil on top. I'm just going to try a coloured pencil now. So this is Van Dyke Brown. So that's no problem using the coloured pencil on top. That one is struggling a bit more with the colour pencil. I can hear it kind of squeaking a bit. I'll try it on this one. So that's not that dark. That's kind of really squeaking, and the colour's very light. If we see on some paper, that's actually a lot lighter, and you hear that squeak. Whereas on our classic gouache, the colour looks kind of darker and richer than on this one. And then our acrylic, very, very light. It really isn't working at all because it's so plasticky. The pencil kind of just can't get any grip. The pigment is not sticking to the paper because these are both so plasticky, whereas this is working over the top quite nicely. And then with the watercolour, well, this would work except it's still wet. Let's do this one. No problem, it's kind of covering it really nicely, and the pencil looks really rich and dark when it's on these. So yeah, in terms of how it takes mixed media, the classic Winsor & Newton gouache and the watercolour take mixed media much better. The acrylic gouache and the acrylic don't take mixed media well. The water-soluble pencil feels like it's just sliding on top and it can't get any grip, which I don't like personally. I really like that this gouache feels velvety and matte, and that you can layer other materials on top, pencils and pastels and that kind of thing. I just wanted to zoom right in on these for a second so we can kind of see the difference with how mixed media looks over the different paints. So this is the Winsor & Newton gouache, and that is the kind of graphite pencil, and then that is the water-soluble pencil, which is Van Dyke Brown, and you can see that showing up nicely on the gouache there. So the next one is the Holbein acrylic gouache. So the HB pencil showed up fine, but this one, the water-soluble pencil, has not shown up so well. It's really, really light. You can see that's how it looks just on the paper, and then that's how it looks on the paint. It's just kind of not sticking at all. This surface is just too shiny and plasticky for the pencil to stick. And then it's the same story with the acrylic, except the pencil, the graphite pencil, doesn't really show up very well with the acrylic, and then this water-soluble pencil definitely doesn't really show up on the paint. And then watercolour, the pencil does show up. It's really nice and rich over the top of the watercolour. So I find that traditional water-soluble gouache and watercolours have the best surface for mixed media. I know people do use acrylic gouache and do use mixed media, so there's probably materials that do work over the top of them, but for me it doesn't work with the type of pencils I like to use, which is a bit of a disadvantage for me, and a reason why I wouldn't use acrylic gouache as my kind of go-to paint in my work. Something else that makes gouache different to acrylics is that it's re-wettable. So on the palette, when it's dry, I can add some water and re-wet it, which to me is an advantage. If you've mixed a colour you love, I can go back and use it. So I often keep old palettes. So this is an old palette, and I like these because I think the palette kind of tells a story of the painting. So this was doing something in my sketchbook with summer flowers. So this is the Californian poppies, and so yeah, to me this kind of tells the story of the painting. I quite like keeping these palettes, and if I go back and do some more Californian poppies, I'll use this again. So very easy to just add some clean or cleanish water and just reactivate that, and then I've got that colour to keep on using. So with acrylics or acrylic gouache, you can use a disposable palette like this, but once it's dry, that's it. So this, I think, is some acrylic gouache, and then as you can see, there's absolutely no re-wetting that at all. It's not going to shift. Once it's dry, that is it, it is dry. So it means if you want to use that colour again, you'll have to mix it up from scratch, which I personally find really annoying. I like being able to re-wet things. The way to get around it is to buy a Stay Wet palette. So I think if you really love acrylic gouache and you're going to use them a lot in your work, it's worth getting a Stay Wet palette. But because I don't particularly love them because of the texture issue with mixed media, I haven't invested in a Stay Wet palette. And we can see that re-wetting here on the paper as well. So I think for people who use acrylic gouache, this is the big advantage, that it doesn't re-wet on the paper. So you can layer up and you can change things, and you can also correct mistakes. It's very opaque, so you make a big mistake, you can paint over it with a lighter colour and change it completely without worrying about anything re-wetting or smudging or getting mixed in. So we can see that this gouache, well, I need some clean water actually, because otherwise it's not really going to make my point. Okay, I've got some clean water. So if we add some clean water to the Winsor & Newton gouache, it's pretty quickly going to start re-wetting and reactivating. The acrylic gouache won't budge, not going to reactivate at all. Even the more watered down versions, still not going to reactivate. And the acrylic, not going to reactivate. And the watercolour will reactivate. So now let's come back to the topic of consistency, and I know that this is one that people really struggle with, especially if they're used to using watercolours and they're used to adding lots and lots of water automatically. So there's no right or wrong consistency with gouache, and I used to paint with much thicker, matte, drier gouache, and that was a big part of my style, and now I paint kind of looser and I add more water. So there's no right or wrong, and how I use gouache kind of changes over time. So as you can see, we can use it straight out of the tube, but that's going to give us that kind of dry effect, which can be quite nice, but there's limitations to using this. You kind of have to move your brush in quite a slow, controlled way, using it this thick. It's going to be very opaque, but you get this dry effect, and if I was painting something like little flowers, you get that kind of dry look. So if I add just a little bit of water to loosen it up, enough that it still kind of looks like gouache on the page, it's still kind of thick and creamy, but a little bit looser, we're going to lose that dry look and have softer brush strokes, which I like. So you can see the difference, that you don't have that dryness and the brush strokes are a bit softer. Bit more water again. So that's really loosened it up a lot, so I can get these really expressive brush strokes, and the brushstrokes themselves are very, very rounded. There's no kind of pointiness to the brushstrokes that you get with these. So I really like that. This is kind of my, oops, sorry, I'm smudging this, my happy area in terms of working gouache, that it's this kind of looseness, that I can be loose and expressive. And then if we just keep adding water, it ends up more like watercolours. And if you just keep adding water, then it becomes very like watercolours, very pale, and also very watery. It can be hard to handle, it can kind of blob together. So for me, this is the kind of my happy area in the middle, which is enough water to handle the consistency, but it still feels like gouache on the page. And the question of whether to add water or white to lighten, sometimes I do both, so we could mix a pink and then also add some water as well, so that we've got that kind of light pink colour whilst also having that looseness. So this is flame red and white plus water. And it's just got a nice consistency on the paper. If you're very used to watercolours, it's really worth just having a little mixing session and just kind of trying to find this consistency, where you can kind of move it around easily and loosely, but it still feels quite solid and opaque on the paper. And then if we compare that to just lightening the red with water, it's obviously very, very different. You know, this is almost like watercolour, and this you really can tell it's gouache. And one of the interesting things with gouache is it dries very different to how it looks on the palette. So how it looks when it dries, very different to how it's wet, and we really see that with the light colours. So you can see where this is drying around the edges, it's going darker. So quite often light colours will dry darker and dark colours will dry lighter. So when you first start painting with gouache, it's a really good idea to paint little test swatches and wait for it to dry and then adjust the colour. When I used to teach, people used to mix up what they thought was a really light grey, paint a big shadow, and then it dried really, really dark grey and kind of dominated the whole painting. Or they'd paint somebody with a light pink face and then suddenly their face was like bright bubblegum pink when it dried. So always do a little test swatch at the beginning. I don't do this now because I've been painting with gouache for years and years and years, and I'm very used to my set, my colours, how they dry. But I did do this for years, so I'll show you one of the test swatches. I have this on my wall just because it's pretty, but you can see I would make a colour and adjust it, make a colour and adjust it, wait for it to dry and just keep tweaking till I get the colour right. And that was a really, for me, I think that's a really big part of the process for learning to use gouache. So now we're going to have a look at creating different consistencies of paint, and also looking at the question of when to add white, when to add water, how that affects the consistency of the paint, and where I use those to create different effects within my work. So first up, we're going to have a look at the difference that adding white makes, and I think it really affects the feel of a colour, not just the opacity and the lightness. So I'm going to start with mixing some green. So I've got permanent yellow deep and I've got primary blue. So we've got a nice kind of fairly middle of the range green here. So just do a nice swatch of that, and that's the kind of consistency I would often use in my work. It's not super watery, it's not super dry, it's thick enough that it still kind of feels quite opaque on the page, but it's also quite loose. So let's say we want to make this lighter. We're painting a tree or some grass and some of it is in sunlight. We want to make it lighter. We could add more white, but when we add more white, it's really going to change the look of the paint. So it's going to become thicker and more opaque and lighter, but it also gives it this kind of pastel-y look. So it's very kind of pastel, and to me it kind of makes it feel less fresh. One of the things that people can struggle with gouache is it feeling heavy on the page, and sometimes when we add white to lighten things but not quite enough white, the colour that we want to feel light actually feels quite heavy and solid on the page. So to me this can feel a little bit heavy and solid, and it doesn't feel light and fresh like leaves in the sunlight. And sometimes I find adding white makes colours feel very kind of pastel, which can also make them feel a little bit unnatural. Sometimes that pastel kind of works well, you know, if you were painting birds' eggs or something and they were kind of a duck egg blue, that might work really well putting the white in. But for me, painting leaves, I don't usually want white in them because it takes away the freshness. So I could try just making this lighter just by adding more water, which kind of for grass feels a little bit fresher. We've got more variation in tone, it doesn't feel as heavy. And I could also add more water and add more yellow as well. So then maybe the top of the grass is lighter in the sunshine and I've got more of the original colour kind of at the bottom. And that kind of feels more natural and more like leaves or grass in the sunlight, rather than that which feels very solid. So for me, I really think about what I want the thing I'm painting to feel like. And in this painting, these ones, I've used white paint in some areas and not in others. So in this one, I have used white paint in the child's clothes and in their skin tone. So they've got this minty green jumper, this very kind of soft muted pinky trousers, and this butter yellow hat. So they've all got lots of white gouache in, and it makes them feel really kind of flat, but it also makes them feel like proper kids' clothes. They're really pastel, soft colours. But then in contrast, we've got the greenery around, and that doesn't have any white in at all, and it feels much more kind of fresh and vibrant and natural. So these to me feel like quite man-made colours, and then this feels more kind of natural colours. And you can see I've layered mixed media over all of this. So this is traditional gouache, so it's taken pencil and neo colour really well. But for me this kind of creates a distinction and a contrast between the child and then the greenery around them. And I usually mix white in with skin tones because I usually want the skin tone to be nice and smooth and even, and then I can work over the top and add the facial features. So I would normally add white into that just to create that even skin tone. And then in this painting, so I've used white when painting things like the ice cream truck and the children and their clothes, because again they feel very pastel. Pastel kind of feels really retro and vintage, which is something that I do like to use in my work. So it's, you know, perfect for an ice cream van, perfect for the children's clothes. And you can see this green is so it's so kind of pastel and minty green, but it's so flat and so even. So it's very, very different to the greenery around, which doesn't have any white in. I've shown that these leaves are in the sunshine by adding more yellow and more water, and that these are in the shadow by adding more blue. I haven't added white to them because I think that would have made them feel heavy and less kind of fresh, whereas for the kids' clothes, I like them having that retro pastel kind of look, and it really works for the ice cream van. And again, it gives us a kind of contrast that the children's clothes are very flat and even. You know, that t-shirt is the same colour all the way over, in contrast with the background where we've got lots of different shades of green, because it's nature and it's more kind of wild. So in these pictures I've been very intentional about where I use white paint and where I don't use white paint, and just thinking about the attributes of the thing we're painting and then how we're mixing it. So as I've said, if I'm painting something like grass, I won't put white in. I want it to feel kind of fresh and have this variation in tone. But if I was painting a scoop of mint chocolate chip ice cream, I definitely would put white in, because it's going to give it that kind of really pastel-y look and the texture. So I could mix up a kind of mint with lots of white, and that really is a kind of proper creamy minty colour. And just a kind of little fun exercise looking at the difference, I'm going to draw 2 glasses with straws. So for this one I'm just going to use flame red, and I'm going to lighten it with water. Which kind of looks like pink lemonade. It looks really transparent. And then for this one I'm going to use flame red, and I'm going to lighten it with white. So you can see it's completely opaque, but also it is much more flat in tone. We don't have that variation of tone, and it doesn't look transparent. So to me this looks like pink lemonade and this looks like milkshake. Just going to do little stripes on the straw just for fun. So yeah, to me that's a nice demonstration of lightening with white, lightening with water, and the different effects they create. That this feels like a transparent drink, and this feels like something thick and opaque and creamy like a milkshake. So it really just depends what the subject is and how you want it to feel. So if I'm painting things that are transparent, I'm normally going to put a lot of water in. So if I'm painting water or shadows, I will normally make those quite watery mixes. And if I'm painting something that's kind of dry or rocky or fluffy or textured, I'm probably going to use a drier mixture of paint to help kind of convey that texture and that feel. Something else that we can think about is using the opacity of the gouache to kind of draw attention in a picture and draw focus. So we could deliberately, let's say we're painting something like a forest, we could lay in a background with very kind of watery gouache to start with, and then maybe when that's dry we could have some more slightly watery trees in the background, and then right in the foreground we could use thicker gouache, which I will demonstrate in a second when that is dry. Because our eye tends to be drawn to the thicker, more solid gouache on the page. So I'll show you an example. So in this piece it's all painted with gouache, but our kind of foreground, where I want our attention to be, the dog and this kind of area, the house and the pot plants, is painted with much thicker gouache. And then in the background it's very watered down, almost like watercolours. So I wanted to include these trees because they're really beautiful, but I didn't want all our attention to be on the trees, so I've done them very watery. And you can see the difference between these feel much softer and much more watery, and then what's here in the foreground feels much more solid. So our attention is drawn here and to the dog, and I've used thicker gouache for the dog, which is quite nice for capturing the kind of the texture of the fur, and then really made the most of the opacity of the gouache in this piece by using white gouache straight out of the tube for these kind of little blobs of snow, and for the snow kind of settling on top of the various surfaces. And I think for me, I wouldn't have been able to do this painting with watercolours. This bit, definitely very watercolours, but this, it really needs the kind of the solidness of the gouache to have this really solid kind of black shadowy area, and then the white on top. And I've done some white with Neocolor Pastel, but actually it's not really bright white. I then went over and added more white straight out of a tube with a brush to really get the feeling of thick, heavy white snow. So yeah, in this piece I've really made the most of the different consistencies of gouache, the more watery and the much thicker as well. And it does really help draw your focus to that area. Another example of this is this piece. So I want our attention to be on the flowers, so they're painted with thicker, more solid gouache, and I've put Neocolor Pastels on top to make them really, really vibrant. And then what's in the background behind the window, I've kept it really soft and hazy and used gouache but much more watered down, so that our attention isn't drawn to that. We're not distracted by that, we're looking at the flowers. So for things like the leaves, this much more watery wash just keeps them very soft and very loose. So they're there, but they're in the background. So back to my little swatch, which is almost dry. So then maybe on top of that, we could have some more kind of little trees in the distance. Building up depth, and then maybe some more solid gouache in the foreground, so mixing up a bit more of that colour but not adding too much water. So then straight away our attention is drawn to that, because it's darker but it's also much more kind of solid on the page. I mean, this isn't a brilliant example, but you can see how we could use that to create a sense of depth and to draw focus to a particular thing within an image. But one thing I would say is, if you want to get better at using gouache and just get used to the consistency, is just kind of practice and find the sweet spot for you, the consistency that you like working at. Which for most people will be somewhere in between that kind of dry, straight out of the tube texture versus basically watercolours. Something in the middle kind of works for most people, so kind of finding a consistency where it's still kind of solid on the page and feels like gouache, but then also has a little bit more movement and a bit more fluid, kind of a bit more fluidity. You can get some nice round brush strokes, but at the same time it's got a decent amount of coverage, and it's more of an even coverage, so I could paint this quite evenly compared to this, which is obviously very transparent, and you've got that variation of tone. I mean, to be honest, all three of these are nice for different things. They just all have very different uses, but I think it's quite nice to have a go, practice sort of making this consistency and getting used to using it. It's a really nice one, especially if you want to get this kind of look in gouache where it's very, very flat and very even. Then it's nice to kind of practice getting this consistency, or even a little bit thicker. Just play around with your set and kind of practice getting that very, very even coverage, which can be really nice to use and really nice to layer mixed media on top of. and just, yeah, have a little play around, do swatches, and kind of find that kind of happy medium in between looseness and then opaqueness. So I really hope this video has been helpful and that it's been a good introduction to using gouache, and a little bit of an insight into how I use it in my work, when I add water, when I add white, when I go for thicker consistencies and when I go for looser, wetter consistencies, and how I kind of put all of those together. You can kind of see in this piece we've got very, very watered down areas. We've got shadows that are really watery, we've got bits of dry texture, which I love, a little bit of dry texture on things like the bushes or things like children's hair. I'll do a little bit of dry texture. We've got looser texture because I want the sky to be loose. We've got shadows that are very watery. We've got clothes that are very flat and even and graphic. We've got variation of colour on the greenery, kind of different pigments coming out. So we've got lots of different uses of gouache within one picture, which is why I love gouache, because it's so versatile, because you can do all of that with one paint. So yeah, hopefully this video has inspired you to have a bit of a play with your gouache and get to know it better as a medium.